Whether you support UBI or are 100% against it, there are some big problems for Canadians given the recent developments that have all happened over the past month. I'm of course talking about the bill that's working its way through the Canadian Senate. So in this video, we're going to talk about the state of this bill, what it means for Canadians, both the good and the bad, how rapidly advancing technology could play a major role in all of this, and the incredibly frustrating problems with the entirety of this contentious debate. It's no secret that many Canadians are struggling to pay for the rising cost of living in Canada, so it makes sense that so many people are turning to this thought of UBI to sort of help them through this, thinking largely the same things that UBI Works, the organization that's pushing a very UBI positive narrative, is making here, saying that basic income helps working people, helps small businesses, it's good for people's health, it helps people who are affected by automation, it could grow the economy, we already have a little bit of basic income through the Canada Child benefit in Canada, and we can pay for it without taxing most Canadians. Especially given the rising food and housing costs, it makes sense that so many people are in favor of a program like this, as they believe that it would help them lift people out of poverty and provide a helpful buffer for lower and middle class Canadians. But I think that there are some big issues here that aren't talked about enough, and I think it has a lot of Canadians worried. One of the most common criticisms of universal basic income programs is wondering how we're going to pay for it and wondering if providing extra funds to Canadians will increase the demand for goods and services, thus increasing prices and negating the possible positive effect of a UBI. At that recent press conference, the one I just showed you a clip of, supportive parliamentarians and senators gave out a fact sheet that they hope will rebuke some of these claims. And inside of this fact sheet, they say, well, a recent analysis suggests that guaranteed livable basic income is unlikely to cause inflation because it involves the redistribution of money rather than the creation of new money. But I found the actual paper or study that she's referencing in this section of the fact sheet, and I found that the conclusion was framed a little bit differently. Take a look at this. They conclude that universal basic income will cause inflation depending on whether or not it spurs strong real growth. Depending on the shape of the benefits in the tax scheme, different growth effects will occur, so each situation is unique. We got to treat them uniquely. And when studying inflation universal basic income, the monetary nature of inflation must be paid heed. They're using a lot of big words here. A suitable policy regime will need to be aware of the influence of cash transfer program on the equilibrium path of nominal output. Okay, that sounds complicated, but it really isn't as complicated as they make it sound. Let me show you this one simple thing, and I promise it's going to make everything else make a whole hell of a lot more sense. During the pandemic, the government needed to spend like crazy to support Canadians and Canadian businesses with various benefit programs like CERB and different business subsidies. Now, contrary to popular belief, when the government spends money, much of that spending isn't actually coming from the tax revenue that's collected, because that's simply not enough to pay for the things that the government spends on. So to get around this, the government sells bonds, essentially IOUs with an interest rate attached to it, to raise money to use in the short term, and they'll pay the interest over the long term. Now, that's in normal times, but during the pandemic, they needed to raise so much money so quickly that there wouldn't be enough buyers to step in and buy these IOUs to raise money for the government. And that's where the Bank of Canada stepped in. And I promise this relates to everything else we're going to talk about. To keep the Canadian economy functioning and to allow the Canadian government to inject all of this money into the Canadian financial system, the Bank of Canada announced something called their Government of Canada Bond Purchase Program, which they announced in March of 2020. And that plan allowed them to purchase $5 billion of Government of Canada bonds every single week, and to continue that program until the economic recovery was well underway. And we can see that spike right here. This is the amount of Government of Canada bonds in Canadian dollar value that the government, or that the Bank of Canada purchased from the Government of Canada. You can see the dramatic increase here when this program was announced, and it topping out at around $434 billion. This number is in millions of dollars. So that's $434 billion of Government of Canada bonds purchased through this government bond buying program. program. But the Bank of Canada didn't have all of this money. They didn't just have this on hand to purchase these Government of Canada bonds. Instead, they created this money through a sort of trick called quantitative easing, where even though they're not actually firing up a printer that's printing paper bills, they add more money into the system by simply adding another zero into their computer system. Now, many people believe that when you increase the amount of money, each dollar is worth less than it was before, and goods increase in price to reflect that reality. And that's exactly what we saw after all this new money was added into the system through this mechanic that we just talked about. We saw this big spike in inflation reaching all the way up to 8.1%. Many people believe that there's a tight connection between the insertion of that new money and the inflation that we saw, or in other words, the loss of value that our dollars saw. So that aside was all to get back to the point that this paper is trying to make, which is essentially it's saying that we don't really know if a UBI would be inflationary because it depends on how the program is implemented. If it's a redistribution of money that's already created, then perhaps it could be not inflationary. But if we're having to create new money, much similarly to the process we just went over, well then that could be a different story and we could see inflation all over again. Now the fact sheet that was circulated says, hey, it's not going to be inflationary because this is just going to be a redistribution of money rather than the creation of new money. But I tend to get a little bit skeptical. Will the government really be able to fund this type of program without the help from the central bank purchasing their debt in the form of bonds? If we can really come to a solution that really does redistribute already existing money, well then perhaps something like this could work, though I think that politicians could have a rather hard time passing that sort of legislation. If we do need to rely on the creation of new money to fund this type of program, well then I worry that the cost in the form of inflation and increased prices could largely outweigh the short-term benefits we could see from the implementation of a policy like this. There also seems to be a lot of confusion about what people actually want. Is it a universal basic income or a guaranteed livable basic income? The differences are absolutely huge, and a lack of clarity about how this could work has some major implications, and a trend that carries across to how this legislation is written, but we'll get to that nonsense in a second. Let's just make clear what these two things are. Universal basic income is something that there's no stipulations around. This is a basic set amount of money that every single Canadian would get with no income testing and no sort of stipulations around it. Everybody would get it. That's where universal comes from. That might sound good, but then there are some questions there, because if you subsidize everybody, if you help out everybody, it's kind of similar to helping out nobody, right? If every single person has $10,000 more a year, don't businesses just then increase prices to reflect the rising demand from this extra cash that's now in people's pockets? Then on the flip side, we have guaranteed livable basic income. This is something that would be income tested. It wouldn't be something that absolutely everybody would get. Only people that can show they qualify for it based on some sort of arbitrarily set income testing or other criteria. And this is what this new legislation alongside this fact sheet are talking about, is a guaranteed livable basic income. They say it would guarantee individuals an income of $16,000 a year, almost $17,000, and couples a $24,000 income guaranteed, but there is a catch. Once you are making $33,000 a year as an individual or $48,000 a year as a couple, well, then you wouldn't get any kind of subsidy here. And even along the way, as you earn more money, getting closer and closer to these sort of cap-out top amounts, well, you would get 50 cents taken off of your guaranteed livable income payment as you earn more money. Now, I definitely think it makes sense to give more money to the people who need it most, but I do worry about programs that operate like this, where there's somewhat of a disincentive to increase your income, or at the very least, a diminished incentive to increase your income. If you are getting a $10,000 raise and it kicks you out of the bracket where you actually can get this basic income, well, then maybe the added responsibility that you're taking on at this new job, maybe it's not quite worth it to make that extra $5,000 because you're accounting for the amount of basic income that you would no longer be getting. Am I making sense here? Now, if you've watched the channel for a while, you'll probably have heard me voice my view that one of the best ways to increase the quality of life in Canada is to increase Canada's productivity per person, or GDP per capita. Now, on the UBI Works page, they talk about how, well, basic income can help small businesses and entrepreneurs, the backbone of a thriving economy. It gives people more freedom to take risks like starting a business, and people spend this money right back into their local economies, helping those businesses grow and hire more. Now, I definitely think that more small businesses and more entrepreneurship could definitely help Canadian productivity, but I do have concerns that while at the outset more Canadians may choose to start businesses given the fact that they have a little bit of extra padding from a basic income program, I do wonder about whether or not the cushion will simultaneously disincentivize people from taking on the lower pay work that often many upstart and small businesses depend on. With businesses needing to pay workers more, perhaps their margins shrink a little bit and it's harder to become successful, or they make the opposite decision and they pass on the increased costs of labor to the consumer, increasing the average costs across the board, which could diminish the positive impact of a basic income program. Now, I don't want to come across like I'm totally discrediting a program like this. I think it's good that we're talking about it, and it's good that we're thinking about it. I just think that we should think about these things additionally. I actually think that some sort of income approach is going to be very, very important moving forward in the future as we have a large growth in our technological capacity as an entire society, including the implementation of AI into the workforce.
You've shared some controversial thoughts about universal basic income. How is the work you're seeing in AI impacting your view of social inequality?
Well, one is that I think the social inequality we have today is nothing compared to what we could have if we don't address it, because AI will just be such a powerful lever. Two is that I think we do have an opportunity as we rewrite the social contract to think about how we can get towards a more equal world. We'll never get all the way there, of course. And human flaws run deep, but I think we're going to have an opportunity to push the reset button and think about the world we want. And I think universal basic income is one part of that.
If we really do get to a world where energy is less scarce and the goods and services that we work to create so that we can consume them, and those aren't scarce anymore, then there's some pretty large questions about what humans do and how we make sure that whatever resources we create through this technology is shared equally and fairly across humanity and not just concentrated in the hands of a few people. But that's actually a good segue into my main concern about UBI. I'm concerned that basic income programs give a lot of power to the people who make and change the rules about these systems. It gives them a lot of power over the people that are beholden or may become reliant on these systems. Imagine this. Let's say that 20 years ago they implemented a basic income program, and it was a government that you trusted and that you liked and that you voted for, and they did a good job of managing it and making sure that things were distributed fairly. All good, right? Now think 20 years into the future from that point, and maybe there's a different political party in power, and they're not as benevolent. They're not as they don't have your best interests in mind. Well, what kind of power does it give them if they can withhold or choose to give this kind of income to certain people based on certain stipulations that they themselves get to control? I mean, personally, I don't think I want a government to have that kind of leverage over me or the people that I love. We can't just think about people right now implementing this thing in a way that we trust and that we can sort of see the process. It could be a very good thing, but we got to think about these points that future political parties could press on to sort of use this as a wedge or to use this to make you do something. Like, how could this be used in a worst case scenario? What could this allow for in the future? I think it's important to think about things through that sort of lens. But one broad frustrating theme that I've seen across all of government is the less and less specific these government bills are getting. Even in the case of this guaranteed livable basic income bill, it doesn't actually do what you might think it does. It doesn't suggest any amounts or any sort of income qualification or any criteria for people to get this sort of thing. And even if this bill were to pass all the way through, well, there wouldn't be a basic income program implemented. This bill has a different purpose, even though people are talking about it like it's going to actually implement a UBI. All this bill would do if it were to pass would be to force the current Minister of Finance to develop a national framework to provide multiple different people in Canada with access to a guaranteed livable basic income. This is just to develop a framework. This is just to go through years and years potentially of development and consultation and talking to different stakeholders and creating a way that this could be implemented in the future. So to me, it seems like when you create a bill like this, well, perhaps you don't give a lot of people the ability to debate it because there's just not a whole hell of a lot of content in the bill itself to debate about. Ultimately, at this point in time, with the information that I've taken in, the only thing I'm convinced that will actually meaningfully increase the quality of life for Canadians across the board, especially in the lower and middle class, is an increase in productivity, the GDP per person, GDP per capita. And I do think that with the advancement of several technologies all happening at the same time, that there is an opportunity for absolutely massive productivity growth. But at the same time, I do think that we need to think about how we can make sure that the value that's created from that additional productivity doesn't only accrue to the wealthy shareholders of a select few companies. That could look like something like a UBI, but right now I do worry about the details of a program like that. Who controls it? Who makes the rules? And what are the consequences of letting that group of people have that amount of power? But like I always say, I could be totally off base about this. These are just my thoughts from the information I've taken in. What have I gotten right here? What have I gotten absolutely wrong? Let me know in the comments. I'm asking for that. I'm trying to learn like anyone else. Let me know what you think down there. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And if you appreciate this type of Canadian content, that helps me out dramatically. So appreciate you clicking that button. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit. And we'll see you next time.